of June, the countdown now to the UK election on Thursday, so going to try and provide you with a short, concise overview of some of the things we're looking at from a trading perspective for the UK election. And starting off with a bit of a timeline of the pound against the dollar, so cable's price movement that we've had ever since the shock result of the e-referendum, which was pretty much this time last year now. Obviously that center of my chart was one of the biggest down days we've ever had for the sterling currency. That was because the market was very much mispriced, if you like, for the outcome to leave the EU. The market was very much positioned, I would say, by a percentage probability, probably 90-10, and so hence the reason why the reaction was so aggressive to the downside, because at that point in time, if you were looking at sterling year to date, because if you look at 2016, if I was to measure that up here with this line, this vertical line, then actually this was a year-to-date high we were trading at the moment the polling booths closed. Obviously you remember that was when Nigel Farage conceded defeat, and was all looking good to remain, only until the likes of really Sunderland, Newcastle started to err slightly more to the side of, well, certainly Sunderland, more leaning toward leave than what the polls were indicating. And so that was the kind of first catalyst for the selling. Other key areas started to swing that direction, and then we had that very big down day. That was then followed by a few other key points. Technically, post-EU referendum low, which was just above that 128 level. You then had a period of recovery for the pound, and actually a lot of that came, for those who remember, this was because it was almost a bit of a pantomime. The Conservative, well, not just the Conservatives, the entire UK political scene was in a bit of disarray, because I don't think even the politicians thought that we would vote to leave the EU. And so actually putting Theresa May in place as the Prime Minister actually took much shorter time than the market was expecting. And that removal of uncertainty in political leadership actually led to a bit of a rally in the pound. And that really defines then the top end of the longer term range that we're looking at, which is more towards this 135 kind of level here. We then moved back lower. The key break of that technical level exacerbated some of the move. The fundamental catalyst here was the Tory party conference when Theresa May spoke about hard Brexit for the first time. We then got down further pressure on the pound after a algorithmic trading inspired flash crash that happened during a Chinese holiday in overnight Asia Pacific trading hours, so very low liquidity in the market, helping exaggerate that price movement. We then recovered and traded very much a 120 really to 128 price movement. The overall economic data not quite as bad as some had feared post-Brexit. However, it's more recently that inflation has started to tick up, and then this 18th of April large up move came after the UK election announcement. And the reason for the strong rally, which took us all the way up to and just above 130, however it's failed to quite sustain that, was because the market foresaw that if there was a 20-point plus percentage gap between that of the Conservatives and Labour, it would mean that the very slim majority of 17 seats that the Conservatives have at the moment could be something even as large as 150. If that were the case, it would mean that Theresa May would not have to appease the hard Brexiteers, and so actually it will give her more flexibility with an overall much bigger majority to the Conservative parties, and that means she can negotiate Brexit better when we get down to the nitty-gritty of it, having triggered Article 50 at the end of March. So what that meant then was we got up to that 130 point. However, we have pulled off since that point in time, but importantly, we still remain above that 128 handle, and we are still quite sharply elevated from where we were before the election was called. Now, transitioning my charts over, looking at the poll of polls, so if I'm just to scroll this down, This is all of the different polls that come out pretty much now on a daily basis. So we're talking about YouGov, Kantar, Panelbase, Ipsos Mori, ICM, Comres, Survation. These are all the main pollsters that are out there. And what's happened is a couple of things. Really, the week in which the manifestos from the parties came out was quite a pivotal turning point, because the Conservative manifesto was it was poorly received in terms of the general public, and therefore reflected in the polls was, you can see, a bit of a pullback in support in favour of the Conservatives. There was this whole U-turn on the dementia tax, and at the same time Jeremy Corbyn has managed to capitalise on this and has seen a very big surge in popularity of himself and the Labour Party, which has caused these two lines to converge as we get closer towards the actual voting day itself this Thursday. A lot of this has come via, I would say, capturing of the attention of a very important demographic, which is that of the 18 to 24-year-old quartile, if you like, of the voting public, which has always been very low representation in general elections. This is because of a lack of interest that young people generally have in this country of taking part in politics. However, given various social media campaigns, Labour has seen a lot of popularity, and registrations are said to be higher than they've ever been for that particular age, which is critical for the Labour Party's success if they are to have any at all. Interestingly though, what's happened is, despite the converging of the polls, if you were to look at cable, and I'm looking at cable now a little bit more zoomed in, so this big uptick you can see here, that was when the election was called on the 18th of April. But really, since that point, we've actually held on to a large portion of those gains. So despite Labour catching up with the Conservatives, the market doesn't seem to have believed that too much. They've only really priced out a very small portion of that move. Comparative to, we were trading more like the mid 125 handles, we're still up really towards 130, a good 5 points or so above that. So that's telling you, from a market positioning point of view, that the market is not believing that really Labour carry much in the way of a credible chance of winning this election. Or, in other words, the market is fairly confident that the Conservatives will have a majority much more improved than their current slim majority that they have in the lower house of Parliament. One of the reasons for this might be because different pollsters have different techniques. And one that a lot of people have been drawing on is this one from YouGov. And YouGov have drawn upon some quite sophisticated, but importantly very new techniques that they've implemented into their election forecasting. And it is YouGov which is generally seen the most narrow spread of the polls. They've been anything really between 1 to 4 percentage points in the last week or so. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you were to go back to the other pollsters like ICM have had gaps, as you can see here, of 11 percentage points. So you've got some pollsters at 1, and you've got a spectrum all the way up to 11. This is the difference between a hung parliament or a huge outright majority for the Conservatives. If you were to look at the average then of the poll of polls, you would still say that the Conservatives have a fairly comfortable 7-8 percentage point lead. That would equate to a fairly sizable majority, and hence the reason why the bookies are still pricing a Conservative win in percentage terms at something like 85%. Theresa May to still be Prime Minister after the election. So on Friday morning, they're pricing that at about 87-88%. Sounds very familiar, right, from the EU referendum. But this is how the market's positioned, and irrespective of the outcome, it's definitely key to factor this in order to know then proportionately where the market is and its pricing, because that will dictate then, if we did get a hung parliament or a Labour situation where they perform particularly well, the most far-reaching of that would be a Labour majority, then this pound has to see quite substantial or huge repricing to the downside in that scenario, comparative to where it is at the moment. Contradictory to that if we were to get a Conservative majority, actually the upside is fairly limited. Okay, a few other thoughts just on the pollsters side of things. This is a very interesting case study. If you get time, I suggest you have a read. It's just looking at why there could be some divergence as well within the pollsters. One interesting point is that demographic, the key one we talked about Labour's hopes pinned on the younger voter turning out on Thursday. Well, one of the pollsters who's at the narrow end of the spread is using a historical norm of 40%, which was roughly the turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds in 2015. Whereas I know that ICM, they're using a benchmark, or excuse me, ICM are using 40%, but some of the narrower ones are using a turnout rate of 80% for young people, which would be double that of the 2015 election. So hence the divergence that you've got in this spread of pollsters. The other interesting points here that I've picked up by a very influential analyst called Nate Silver of the blog site 538, who's a specialist on kind of mathematical modelling on politics. And the important thing here is a couple here, 7 points, just to quickly go over. And one is, I think, very important in the context of what we had with Trump. One of the points he says is about shy voters who don't state their true voting intentions. If you remember, when we were leading up to the US election, it was almost criminal if you talked about you were a fan of Trump or you supported Trump. People thought you were a racist, people thought you were a bigot, people thought you were a sexist, all these different things. It was almost you couldn't have a logical political conversation because you were demonized if you were supporting the other side. Now, I would say that it's certainly not to that extreme, but in this UK election there is a little bit of similarity in the sense that you don't really hear Conservative people shouting down the street saying, I'm going to vote Tory, because what happens, people, generally speaking, greet that negatively. But if you were Labour, you would hear young people very much voicing their opinion via the platform of social media. And don't forget, who uses these social media platforms? It definitely is not the plus 55, plus 65 age group, which is where voting in history for general elections is where the balance of power lies, is with the older voter who typically turns out and votes every election, whereas young people don't. So definitely one thing that could be underestimated here is the shy voters who actually just through kind of politically in the current kind of society are shying away of saying it, but when it comes down to it, much like Brexit, they actually vote Conservative on the day. The other things to look out for is overly lax turnout models. That's, as we've just discussed, about the divergence between the likes of YouGov and their new form and ICM with their historical kind of preferences. 3, last-minute swings that come too late in the campaign to be captured by polls. You know, one thing that's happened is things like the terrorist attack that took place on Saturday in central London. We'll be monitoring the polls over the coming days, whether that would have much difference. But you know, looking just objectively at that situation, the Conservatives did bounce back slightly when the Manchester situation occurred, and typically that kind of strong and stable mantra was something which Theresa May was talking about quite aggressively in her press conference today. And will that win over voters is yet to be seen. Other things, non-representative samples or improper demographic weighting, so again kind of fits into the argument we were just talking about. Other things, incorrect assumptions about undecided voters. Tactical voting is also another consideration to be aware of, i.e. you know, so say if you're UKIP are going to perform extremely badly in this particular election comparative to their popularity that they had really under the stewardship of Nigel Farage during the Brexit process. UKIP are nowhere to be seen in this general election. That will likely be the case. But tactical voting would say then that everyone is UKIP, might not fully agree with everything the Conservatives are saying, but they're definitely going to vote Conservative over Labour. And has this convergence in the polls just stoked the fire of Conservatives is kind of like a call to arms, if you like. A lack of complacency, like what might have happened with the Remain situation in the EU referendum. Maybe now we get this tactical voting come into play. And the other thing is pollster herding toward incorrect targets. But I would say, given the wide divergence in pollsters in the UK specifically, actually that's probably a lesser degree in this point. So a couple of things, food for thought, to look out for. One of the ways, though, that really I break down the scenarios here for trading this event. So let's talk more about execution over the actual event itself. And this is a really excellent graphic by the analysts at Barclays. And I really think you can define, like they have done, the election night by 4 categories. You've got strong Conservative victory, you've got a slim Tory majority, you've got a hung parliament, or you've got a hung parliament with a more leaning towards Labour. So let's just, kind of strip out an outright Labour majority, if you like. Although I will discuss what that would mean in terms of market pricing if that were to occur. So at the moment, the market's kind of priced for something in the region of around a 50 to 70 seat majority for the Conservatives, if you're looking at it on balance. Now, what would that mean? So as Barclays are looking at, if we just look specifically at FX, sterling appreciates about 1% versus the euro. Option implied sterling change range about 2% appreciation to 1% depreciation. So if we go back to the chart, I would say that it depends really the size of the majority, how far this pound will rally on the upside. I think if she gets something like a 50-seat majority, then certainly we'll get a retest of those recent highs. 130.59 would probably, I'd say in the short term, push above there. But what I'm saying is that it's more like a relief rally in this price, which is already positioned for really that outcome to occur. Now, if she did get 100 plus seats, 150 even, then certainly we'd see a pretty quick run, I would imagine, up to retest the top end of this range that's been in play post the actual EU referendum itself. That's more in toward the 135 handle, if that were to occur. So what I'm saying is the market isn't quite priced for such a positive outcome from the Conservatives, but likelihood we'll get a bit of a repeat of that April 18th type price action if that was the case. If we get a slim Conservative majority, then this starts to get scaled down a little bit. And actually, if we get something in the region, I would say, of suggesting sub 50, then I would probably expect this price to start moving south. Any move beyond 128.06 and starting to retrace that move of that sharp move higher on April 18th would probably exacerbate some of the downside and some technical momentum selling as well. Anything heading towards a hung parliament, then let's say if they get a bit of a repeat, the problem that you have here is that if the Conservatives only perform similar to the slim majority they have already, well then really Theresa May has failed on her gamble to call a snap election. And if anything, I would say her future leadership of the Conservative Party comes under some question. And she might be forced out by the more hard Brexiteer type Conservatives. Obviously in this situation, I would say we're going to go down to 125. If we get a hung parliament situation, then I think the price over the days thereafter is certainly going to come heading towards sub 125 and below pretty quickly. So definitely a pullback. A slim majority for the Conservatives, I'd be anticipating a pullback of that kind of move that we had in early April on the snap election call, 126. A hung parliament is going to be pressured even further. And really, I'd be looking at acceleration towards the bottom end of the range that we've had really since the Q3, Q4 of last year. So the bigger proportional move is definitely to the downside. If you get a situation, I mean, one question I did have, what if Labour win? What if there is a massive shock and Labour get a majority? How would the pound react? And asking myself that question, I actually think we might get a bit of a repeat of what Trump, the night of the US election, if you remember, if you traded that event, it all went to plan for about 4 hours or so. Once Trump started to win the swing states, all of a sudden gold started surging, the S&P started tanking, it hit limit down in the futures of 5%, only then to rally aggressively as people moved their attention from a risk trade to the Trump trade about fiscal stimulus and so on. If Labour were to win, I actually think you might get something similar, where I think the first initial reaction would be a negative one, but actually in the medium term, if you think about it, Labour's manifesto would imply at least £25 billion a year rise in borrowing on average in order to fund the National Transformation Fund, i.e. the nationalisation of key industries. So actually this kind of government spending might actually cultivate a pickup in the UK economy, and therefore might bring forward inflationary prospects even more aggressive, and the possibility then of a rate hike from the Bank of England will probably be shortened on the time frame. Hence, actually, it could end up being supportive of the pound in that example. But I still think knee-jerk reaction would be very aggressive selling. Okay, moving on. A few other considerations for you trading this event. Now, this isn't just a picture of a street that looks like a river. This was the photo that my wife sent me on the day of the EU referendum. So my wife and I were going to meet up. We were going to go down to the voting booth after work together. This was the site outside her office in Battersea Park. It was probably about a foot of rain. And actually, on the train on the way home, I remember on the Northern Line, Tooting Beck was underwater, station closed, as were, I think, several stations on the day of the vote. Now, this might sound a bit weird why I'm talking about the weather, but if you remember, London is probably one of the most highest areas of voting to remain in this country. Maybe it's a reflection of the ethnic diversity and so on and so forth, but what actually played a key part in the overall outcome was these adverse weather conditions restricted people of London being able to get home in order to vote. Because remember, the voting booths and the system in the UK works by you need to vote on the day between 7 AM and 10 PM. That's your only time. You cannot cast it in advance, as what we saw with the US election process. This then led to a lower participation rate in London, which actually would have had an underlying influence to the end outcome, because the numbers of votes coming out of London wasn't as high, and they were obviously pivotal in supporting the Remain camp. So my attention then moves to what's the weather forecast for Thursday. And I know it sounds like an odd thing in order to trade financial markets, but I'm going to have to turn weatherman for a good minute or so. And I don't like the way I'm seeing a bit of a dark cloud here looming, which means that if you think about it, if there's bad weather, how is that going to influence people's ability to vote? If you were going to go with cliches, would your older, distinguished, retired gentleman be want to navigate the downpour against your rambunctious young Labour supporter who's ready to hit the rain, sleet or snow in order to cast his vote? It could be interesting on how that might influence the outcome. The very interesting thing happened the day after Brexit. I remember the sun was shining, and it was just a one-off day of call it fate, call it intervention from above, but things like this can occur, and things like this will be important if the weather is bad. I wouldn't discount it. And so participation rates could also be key as we go through Thursday. Okay, so now I want to quickly talk about what if we don't get a conclusive result at 10 o'clock. So voting in the UK finishes at 10 PM. So at 10 PM, I remember during the UK election in 2015, I was sat there at 10 p.m, 4 weeks of research and analysis, ready to guide traders through the entire night, every individual council or district coming out with results. And then Sky News snapped an exit poll 1 second past 10 p.m. Cable rallied, I can't remember the exact figure, something like 250 pips in a matter of minutes, and then it did absolutely nothing for the entire night. Now, why did that happen? Because the polls in 2015 were indicating a hung parliament, and what the exit poll indicated was a much bigger gain to the Conservatives. And so then the overnight process of monitoring all the individual results coming in was just a formality. So we could, and this is probably a more likely outcome of how you're going to trade the event, is that you need to be at 10 o'clock as soon as the exit poll, the polling booth shut, exit polls release their figure, it might already be a conclusive landslide to the Conservative Party. If that's the case, we're looking for then a move higher, albeit proportionately smaller than if it was indicative of an inconclusive race, i.e. very close between the Conservatives and Labour, or at least indicating that Theresa may have lost her very slim majority. If that is the case, the whole night of the UK election takes a completely different tactic in order to trade that event, because it goes over from being a one snippet piece of information and having a definitive answer to how this is going to play out to absolute uncertainty. And then we would go back to the same format as when we were trading the EU referendum. It goes then down to what to expect, as you can see here on the UK election night, hour by hour. Now, there's a couple of key things here that I want you to look at. And what Bloomberg have done here is a really great oversight of some of the key things going by hour by hour. So last time, in the 2015 election, it was actually a place called Nuneaton in the Midlands at 1:50 a.m. that set the stage for Cameron's eventual victory. Not only did Ed Miliband Labour fail to take a must-win bellwether seat, the Tories actually increased their share of the vote. And so going through what people are looking out for this time is, well, first of all, something to be aware of. If the result is close in any given district, be aware that a recount could actually delay the announcement. It could prolong the entire evening. But starting off with 10 o'clock, exit polls. Exit polls absolutely critical to this event. It could be you're in for a one trade and done type scenario, and you get a very sharp, quick spike in the market in terms of the sterling currency. Last time it gave the Tories a 316 seats, just short of a majority to Labour's 239. The Tories actually ended up even better. By the time we'd come in, it was a majority, 331 against Labour's 232. Looking at this time round, actually results start to come out not until 11 p.m. and then it's almost like deja vu with the e-referendum. It's Sunderland are back again. Now, for those who followed my briefings ahead of the e-referendum, you'll remember Sunderland have this historical, it's almost, they're such a proud city of getting out their result first. It's something that they always do. And so I do have a complete breakdown of all the different timings, which we'll look at shortly, and I'll send out to you ahead of the event. But Sunderland is going to be key. Now, Sunderland, they're likely to finish their count first. They're scheduled to announce results before midnight, and it should be a safe Labour seat. No Tory has won there since 1959. But don't forget, Sunderland voted even more so for Brexit. This is the problem that you have with a lot of the traditional Labour strong seats, is that they might be favourable for Labour policies, but they are the same people that voted for Brexit. And if you're looking at Brexit and you're looking at following through with that with more gravitas or authority, then you would certainly say the Conservatives is probably the stronger argument for that. And so it will be very interesting. Some of these might not be as concrete as they have been in the past. It's worth noting that YouGov polling during the campaign showed the biggest regional swing to the Tories was in the northeast. So actually, when you talk about target areas in the UK, it's the northeast, which historically is very Labour or left, that because of this Brexit and immigration issue could well be tipped the balance. Looking forward, you get to 1 AM, you start to get some of the first strongly pro-EU but conservative held Battersea, Putney, so some of these London boroughs start to come in. They're scheduled to give the first indication of how the election played out in the capital, where the Tories have found it difficult to take votes from Labour en masse. London is very Labour leaning. We're not expecting any of those seats are likely to change hands, but as we go through into 1:30, we're due to get 3 results in Labour held seats at around that time that will show whether Tories have made gains. This is a key one to look out for, is Wrexham in North Wales. The Conservatives need just a swing of 2.8 percentage points from Labour. Again, would suggest they're on course then. It'll be one of the first kind of swing areas to suggest whether they're on course to increase their majority to more than 50 seats at that point, given the ones that are more expected to go their way up until there. Back in the northeast, the Tories only need a 3.8 point swing in Darlington as well, and that's coming between 1:30 and 2. When it comes to 2 AM, if we start to get further down, by this point, it starts to ramp up. We'll get about 50 results by that point. There'll be further evidence of how well have they done. So really, by 2 AM, 2:30, much like the EU referendum, we should by then start to have seen how well or how bad have the Conservatives done. The list goes on, and it's a really great breakdown. I'll send this out to you tomorrow morning with this video preview, and you can have a read of that in your own time. One of the key things here is this is the declaration times in time order. Now, if you're a trader trading this event and it is inconclusive, which let's not forget, that is the lesser likely scenario. But if we do go into this council by council situation, this is your absolute Bible for trading the night in some respect, because this is all of the times which are going to be absolutely critical or pivotal to potential market movement. What I would do is I would correlate the Bloomberg article of the ones that have a tight swing factor of potential voting Labour but could swing Tory, identify them on here, highlight them, and then they're the key ones you need to look for. This is a classic example of when I would use my search facility on something like TweetDeck, where I would have someone like Sunderland, someone like Wrexham. These key areas we've just discussed would all be in predefined categories, so I could catch talk and rumours around those sectors first in order to front run any move that comes on the major news wires. Finally, just in terms of reaction, the FTSE's a bit of a funny one in terms of classic economic theory has kind of gone out the window a little bit. If I show you here, this is a chart of the FTSE 100 CFD, which I know some of the newer traders here at Amplify trade. And I'm looking at the low from the EU referendum to where we trade now in the FTSE 100, and we've risen 33%. That's an incredible amount. And the thing that's interesting here is, in the short term at least, the correlation being the more negative the result, i.e. the more if we get in towards a hung parliament it becomes, the smaller the Tory majority is, the more negative the pound moves, i.e. lower, the more positive that's going to be for the FTSE because of that correlation we've had of the divergence between the two. And so if we get a strong pound move and an outright huge majority for the Conservatives, and the cable breaks this upper bound of the recent range for the last several months, that's likely to weigh quite heavily on the FTSE on the intraday basis. So keep that in mind. Okay, going to leave it at that. Not possibly quite as concise as I would have hoped for, but obviously it's a very big topic. I'm excited. You should be excited. This is what we live for in the financial markets, and also from a political point of view. Obviously, it's our chance to have our say on the future of our country. So I hope everyone is involved. Okay, guys, I'll have a full, thorough preview, though. We'll go over again in more detail. I'll send out all of the accompanying details I've discussed here to our in-house traders on Thursday. So have a good evening, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.